because what we're fighting for is a world which in many ways is at a critical crossroads. On the one hand, we could face a future on a blighted planet where ecosystems continue to decline, where inequality continues to rise, where the rights of many are not upheld, where the few continue to rise and the many are left behind. Or we could choose a different future. We could choose to build a world where we truly ensure that the benefits are shared fairly, a world where the rights of all are actually upheld, a world where we do reach zero poverty by 2030, which is the aspiration and objective that is being agreed here this week. So we're meeting at a critical time in the world. And when you look at this agenda that we have before us on climate justice, on the role of business and human rights, it really touches on the nexus of the issues that are on the minds of many people coming here this week in New York, which is billed to be one of the largest gatherings of world leaders in human history. So I think, this year, obviously, with the Financing for Development Conference in Addis, the meeting here this week to agree the Sustainable Development Goals, the Climate Summit in December, are all part of one overall critical message, which is that we need to place the planet and its people on a safe trajectory towards a just, thriving, net zero emissions economy in a very short period of time. So we have no time to lose, but we're very lucky to have with us tonight an esteemed panel of experts, of activists, of passionate individuals, of business leaders who are really trying to drive this transition through their own companies. And I think none of us can forget that we have a fierce urgency in which we need to act. I'd like to introduce some of our panelists today to say a few words about themselves. And then what we're going to do is pose a few questions and hear from our panelists, and then open it up to some questions from all of you. So I'd like to first introduce Jackie Patterson, who's with us from the NAACP. Jackie, why don't you say a little bit about yourself and tell us why you're here today?
Sure. Yes, so my name is Jackie. Okay, yeah. So my name is Jackie Patterson. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Jackie Patterson. I'm with the NAACP. I'm the director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program. Glad to be here with you today because working on making this transition to a world where extraction and profiteering and domination really of a number of our key systems are disproportionately impacting certain communities, which is the core of the NAACP's work around civil rights. So looking forward to partnering in terms of changing various business models to make our systems more sustainable for the planet and for its people. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Jackie, why don't you tell us a little bit? I mean, you're really at the center of the struggle here in the United States. You're seeing that climate change is already having impacts on the lives of people across the country. Talk to us a little bit about what moves you, what are the injustices that you're seeing, and what are the solutions that we really need urgently to drive forward.
Yeah, thank you. So as we all know, the United States is 4% of the world's population, but 25% at this point, at a lower point, it used to be 33% of the emissions that drive climate change. And those emissions come from industries and practices that are disproportionately located in low-income communities and communities of color, and disproportionately impact those communities as well as certain populations like women, as well as people with special needs. And also the impacts of climate change also disproportionately impact those same populations. So the work that we do looks at each of those types of industries and how and the drivers, and really looking at a mitigation model that both protects the planet and protects the people who are disproportionately impacted. So when we look at the energy sector, we look at the fact that 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, which means that the emissions from coal-fired power plants like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, all of these various pollutants are disproportionately impacting those communities, and they're also the coal-fired power plants are also the number one driver of, the number one contributor of carbon dioxide, which is the number one driver of climate change. So we see how, again, that these communities are caught in the crosshairs of these very industries that drive climate change. And so, and how we see the impacts of that is African American children, for example, in the Bronx right here nearby, are 5 times more likely to enter into the hospital from asthma, and 3 times as likely to die from asthma attacks. We also look at the food production, in particular the commercial animal production, and those types of facilities, disproportionately located again in communities of color and low-income communities, bringing all types of odors and so forth, and often polluting waters that folks fish out of, and also a major contributor to methane production that again drives climate change. Looking also at how we deal with waste in general, whether we're burying it or we're burning it, we're also emitting a lot of methane into the air through this process, and those landfills and incinerators are disproportionately located in communities of color and low-income communities. And then whether it's our roads or our bus depots or our shipping channels, these are all places where we have a lot of emissions as well through just transportation processes, and those again are disproportionately located in communities of color and low-income communities. And then on the other side, we see the impacts, whether it's severe weather events, where these communities tend to be more vulnerable to these severe weather events. The shifts in agricultural yields, already these communities are more likely to be in food insecure. And also sea level rise. We actually have more vulnerable communities living in coastal areas than other communities. And for whether it's Thibodaux, Louisiana, or Kivalina Island in Alaska, they're facing imminent displacement from sea level rise within the next 15 years. Thibodaux is actually losing a football field of land a week due to both the seas rising as well as the land sinking because of excessive oil drilling that happens in that area. And so as we look at solutions, we're really looking at making the shift, working with businesses to make a shift from these models of extraction and of polluting practices, changing to our energy systems to a decentralized energy systems where we're generating our energy through solar and wind, and actually having shared ownership of our systems by having distributed generation that's owned by communities and individuals. We want to shift our food production systems so that we're not doing this mass production and not only polluting certain communities, but also through the production, but also polluting communities through the transportation process. So we're looking at building local food movements and how we can decentralize the food systems. Looking at moving our waste from having these large landfills and incinerators to having local recycling and waste diversion. And then also looking at how all of this actually ties into, because whether it's big ag, big energy, some of these big companies, they're actually influencing our political system to such an extent. As we know, the Koch brothers are planning on putting $889 million into the next elections. And so therefore, and when we look at even the coal industry, and I'll wrap up with this, with coal mining, 76,000 coal miners have died of black lung disease since 1968, while the coal mining industry has actively fought against regulations for coal mine dust. And so we really need to be looking at decentralizing the way profits are made, and also looking at shifting from our kind of bought systems of democracy to campaign finance reform, and looking at uplifting voting rights, so that we actually have a system where all voices count, all votes count, and all rights are upheld. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. And I think it's really critical around this agenda for you to be able to bring out how these impacts are affecting people all over the world, and that as we look at this agenda this week, it's about all countries, all companies, all citizens. We all need to change. We all need a reset.